Ladies and gentlemen, the session will begin shortly. Please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, the session will now begin. Please take your seats. President Trump's America First policy and his obsession with bilateral trade balances have deeply affected transatlantic trade. At the same time, the newly renegotiated NAFTA contains more restrictive rules of origin, which could also affect value chains across the Atlantic. And by defying its rules and blocking the appointment of its judges, the United States may be on its way to relegating the WTO to oblivion. What explains the US's protectionist stance? To which extent are the other economic powers responsible for these developments? How did the November midterm elections change the picture? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the moderator for this session, Executive Board of the International Press Institute, John Yearwood.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you. Good to be in Marrakesh, back at the Atlantic Dialogues. We're going to have a really fascinating conversation about Atlantic trade. And if you didn't think that was possible, wait till you hear this powerhouse panel. One of the things I want to make it clear to the audience is that this really is about you. So we want to get as much participation from you as possible. I'm here to help guide the conversation, and the panelists are here to give you some information from their points of view and their knowledge. But we really want you to get engaged in this conversation we're about to have. So we should get started by inviting our powerhouse panel to please come to the stage. We'll start with Anabel Gonzalez. Anabel is the former Minister of Foreign Trade for Costa Rica, followed by Dadush, who is the Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, who's followed by Paulo Portas, who is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs for Portugal, and then by Ricardo Meléndez-Ortiz, who is the founder and Chief Executive, International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development. Please help me welcome them. Anabel, we'll start our discussion with you in light of everything that we're seeing and everything that we're hearing that's happening on the trade front. Latin America seemed to be developing its own path. And not too long ago, we had Costa Rica and other countries in Central America signing a trade pact, for example, with South Korea. In fact, I understand now that the Costa Rican coffee is more popular in South Korea than maybe kimchi. So, but I wanted though to have you talk a bit about what is happening in Central America and certainly throughout Latin America, and in light of what we've been seeing coming out of Washington, how much of that credit do you give to Donald Trump?
Well, thank you very much, John, and I'm delighted to be here. And let me start by saying that most Latin American countries, not all, but many Latin American countries have in fact entered into preferential trade agreements with the United States, with the European Union, 3 of them actually, Chile, Peru, and Costa Rica with China, with South Korea, as you very well said, and among each other. And probably the most sort of relevant, if you wish, process that we've seen lately is the renegotiation of the NAFTA between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. This is very important because it's the most important relationship in the hemisphere, but also because there was a lot of contention, of course, around the negotiation. But negotiations are concluded. Now it's a new chapter opening up, which is the approval in the Congress or parliaments of each of the countries, but in particular in the U.S. Congress. And I think that we are going to hear a lot about that in the month to come in 2019.
Yuri, let's go to you to talk about Africa in terms of, you've been very, very deeply involved in African trade issues and discussions. Talk to us about what's happening, what you see happening on the continent, and how Africa is really making its own way as it relates to trade.
So the main development is the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has been signed by something like 45, 49 countries. I don't remember the exact number, including Morocco, by the way, and Egypt, Tunisia, etc. South Africa as well. I think Nigeria is still considering it. I'm not sure whether they've signed or not, but they said they intend to sign. And the African Continental Free Trade Area is a free trade agreement that will cover all of Africa. It's a very important development. Of course, whether it succeeds or not depends a lot on domestic policies, not just on trade policies. And why is it important? Well, there are 3 or 4 things, just very quickly, to note about African trade. Number one, there's very little of it. African trade, the trade of the countries of Africa is predominantly outside of Africa. And there's a very good reason for that. That's point number 2, which is that African countries practice very high tariffs vis-a-vis each other. And especially so in what they call sensitive products, which is a large part of this product spectrum, manufacturing, a lot of agricultural products, the kind of stuff they really would like to export to each other, they tend to have very high tariffs on. On the other hand, they enjoy large preferences on international markets. So it's much easier, and furthermore, they have a big logistics problem inside Africa, but they have an easier logistics outside of Africa, okay, because the ports work, et cetera, at least outside of Africa. So the net result is that it is easier for an African entrepreneur to sell to Europe, to sell to the United States, or to sell to China than to sell to another African country. And so this combination is one of the things that's keeping Africa back. It's not the main thing. Even after a free trade agreement, they're going to need to do a lot to improve their competitiveness and the diversification of their economies before they get a real bump from trade. But it's an important step forward.
Thank you. I want to go to Paulo. There's been a lot happening in Europe in terms of Europe trading not only within the EU, but also outside. There's even some news this week in terms of Japan. Why don't you talk to us about what's happening in Europe, and you can even touch on Brexit if you want to.
Okay. Brexit is like Winston Churchill once said about Russia. It's an enigma inside a mystery, inside a secret. Okay? If someone knows exactly what is the end of the story, I think you should give him the Nobel Prize. But Let me just tell you one thing. Europe is not politically in good shape, as everybody can see, read, and understand. There are moments like that. Okay, Germany is changing leadership. UK is leaving, or something similar to that. French president, should I say diplomatically, surrendered last Monday. And Italy is governed by two populist parties. So Spain, some kilometers from here, is challenged by separatism. So things are very... And the Eastern Europe it's apparently looking more to Moscow than to Brussels, both with Russophobia and Russophilia, different countries. Okay, so politically, it's not our best moment. But on trade, I want to be fair. If there is one field where European Commission and European policy is trying to fight for the right values with consequences, not just rhetoric, is trade. Pay attention, 2018, first year of provisional application of the free trade agreement between Europe and Canada. 2018 also, authorization or mandate to negotiate a free trade agreement with Japan, the third largest economy in the world. Also, in 2018, the renewal of the EU agreement with Mexico. If there is nothing if nothing fundamental change, Mexico will go more or less close to 2050 from the G15 to the G8, if you consider global economies. And at the same time, the European Commission is negotiating, has authorization to start negotiations with countries so relevant like Australia. So, Europe is moving on trade. Europe is the largest economic bloc if it is united. We are very exposed, more than the Americans, to foreign trade impacts, because we have a lot of economies very exported-oriented. And if there is one field where I think Europe is working, it's on trade. But I want just to underline one thing about your question. It's not exactly recommendable to make a lot of projections in this complex world. Okay, the deputy of Christine Lagarde said this week he was seeing the perfect storm aligning in the stars about a global crisis. And what you can see, I don't know if it is the imperfect storm or the perfect storm. Well, what you can see, the third quarter in the United States was worse than the second. And there are some signs that the fourth quarter can be worse than the third. Pay attention to the controversy between the President of the Federal Reserve and the President of the United States. How much level you need to increase interest rates in 2019. Pay attention to the real estate figures and car sales in the United States internal market. Something is happening there. The second item I would call your attention is China is reviewing all the projections from 6.9, 6.8, 6.7, 6.6, 6.5, and there are rumors that the final of this year it's closer to 6. Japan back to negative growth, minus 0.3 in the third quarter, and Europe, to close my remark, Europe, unhappily, is becoming more and more far from the 2%, which was a modest joy to the economy of Europe. But mainly because Germany is suffering the impact of global trade. tensions. It's a largely exporter economy, and mainly because France and Italy seems to be stuck. Okay? So those are, if you consider all these stars, things would recommend a prudent year in 2019, I would say.
Well, you gave us a lot there to think about, and particularly if you're from the United States, particularly with those mysterious forecasts. But before I go to Ricardo, who I would like to talk about the U.S., I want to come back to Anabel for a minute because I wanted to get your sense of China, because you've done a lot of work on China and what's happening there as it relates to trade. I just got back from Beijing and Shanghai. There's a tremendous amount of anxiety there about what's happening. What's your sense of what's happening on the ground there?
Well, John, I think it's important to put the U.S.-China confrontation in perspective. And let me say a few things to that. First is that the actual numbers of the trade involved in the confrontation are larger than what is normally reported in the press, because what is normally reported in the press refers to the trade that is impacted by the tariff hikes. But there are a number of non-tariff measures that are also impacting the trade. So some numbers show that it's about some 370 billion US dollars of Chinese exports to the US that are impacted. So first, the scale is bigger. But second, one important point to bear in mind is that this trade has been thoroughly distorted for a long time. Even before the tariff hikes went about in 2017, 70% of Chinese exports in the U.S. market and 70% of U.S. exports in the Chinese market confronted distortions. So this is something that also comes from the past. Now, having said that, it is something that can get much worse. And there are a number of studies out there that says that, you know, if all hell breaks loose, eventually tariffs could be raised to up to 32 to 60%. So we could see, you know, a greater crisis in going forward. Now, having said that, the trade that was impacted by the tariff hikes this year represents 22% of the global trade that has been impacted by new distortions in 2018. Why? Because it's not only the US and China that are being impacted in each other's markets, and it's not only tariff hikes. There's also subsidies to exports, subsidies to domestic producers. There's also tariff hikes in other parts of the world. So the point that I want to make is that although the bilateral confrontation is important and needs to be addressed, actually the sort of coverage protectionism that has been building for the past decade or so requires something more than a bilateral solution and points us to the need to work at the multilateral level to try to address this protectionism that, as I said, has been building for a number of years, and that we're seeing here this big confrontation, but actually that's in a way, you know, sort of like the peak of the iceberg, because there's much more there. So maybe in another moment, I'd like to come back and talk about the WTO reform, because I think that that is really where things should be addressed.
Terrific. We'll come back to that because also there's a lot happening there. Now I want to go to Ricardo. There's all this global trade angst, largely because many of that was set in motion by President Trump, who famously says that he can win a trade war. Is he winning?
Well, so let me pick up also from where Anabel has left. And let's start just by saying that maybe the question is, can he tariff the U.S. out of the deficit, as he has tried to? And I'll come back to explain what I mean by that. And so the thing with President Trump and the trade policy of this administration is that it's very hard to see a strategy behind it. There seems to be a reactive set of actions and measures that have been taken. I would think in a very late manner. So this is reactive to effects that, for instance, not only the accession of China to the WTO, but before China acceded to the WTO in 2001, the Chinese economy was having effects on jobs and employment in the U.S. And now I think that it's been settled by economists that that was the case, that China was playing a low-skilled, low-cost labor card that made it really a factory to the world, also with very unclear rules on subsidies, even within the once it was part of the WTO. And so the Trump administration seems to be, in that respect, again, responding to what may have happened in the first decade of this century by going back to the policy tool box of 50 years ago. So it has now undusted Section 232 on security, on taking protectionist measures for security reasons. And as I was saying earlier today, it's very difficult to see where protection, legitimate protection, particularly from a security perspective, and protectionism, where they overlap or they don't. And that explains the steel tariffs that he has put in place. Then it undusted that was a 1962 Trade Act, right? That tool. Then from 1974, he brought up what is called Section 301 to try to go after China in this technology race that we are seeing between, again, China and the U.S. particularly. So to try to confront China. What's interesting there is that using those measures is going before the WTO times. So again, in a different dialogue today, I was remarking that it's very interesting that 24 years ago here, we signed the Marrakesh Agreement that saw the creation of the WTO. At that point, the U.S. was all willing, as were all the other participants in the Uruguay round, to sign to a set of supranational instruments, including a court to manage disputes, ceding sovereignty. And today, President Trump's, again, actions are exactly in a different direction. So I think that's just to put it in context. So now, what is coming out of all this? Using tariffs, imposing tariffs in a way that is WTO inconsistent prima facie. I mean, we don't have yet the results of the many dispute settlement cases that have been brought against the U.S. for the imposition of all these tariffs in the past 2 years, but they're clearly inconsistent with WTO obligations. What is coming out of all that? I think if we think there are at least two positive medium-term, I think, consequences. One is the possible reform of the WTO, as Anabel said. I mean, if we have to settle these issues, they should be settled on rulemaking, on creating frameworks that allow countries to deepen their cooperation and to understand. Well, these frameworks on international trade, they're nothing else than instruments that help countries manage the negative spillovers of domestic policies on other countries, or to level the competition among countries. And so we may have actually a better and stronger WTO multilateral trade system if, as a consequence of these actions, we actually get into the serious business of correcting some of the shortcomings that we had in the WTO that was created here in Marrakesh 24 years ago. That's one possible positive consequence, and we can go in details on what exactly that means. Then the second positive consequence that we're seeing already, and I think we all have mentioned that, is a spurt of regional integration all over the world. So you have the situation in Latin America, where the Latin American countries start looking into harmonizing, say, for instance, several agreements into one. That's the Pacific, the Pacific Alliance, creating a really powerful space for growth that they didn't have before. They start looking at diversifying their external markets, the case of Mexico, Mercosur, that you start finally getting some more serious talks about integration between the Andean regions and Mexico and the southern regions in the continent. And you go on and you find in Africa, finally again, I'm arguing that the Trump administration actions may have served as to catalyze what had been evasive for so many years here in Africa. Now going into this further integration of the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Same in Asia. So you have incredible amount of dynamics of integration in Asia. And then you have Europe, which is now looking into its major partners to organize regional trade agreements. So you have a situation again where the Trump administration may have created positive consequences in the medium term. And that's still an unknown.
Yeah, and I know that Paulo wants to get into this, but Paulo, as you think about that, also think about what I was told when I was in Beijing. I was speaking to a trade expert, and he made an interesting observation. He said that what he believes is behind this trade war is the belief that the U.S. would like to cut China down to size, if you will, that being now the second, the largest economy, he made the point that Japan was there, Britain was there, and others. And this is the U.S. trying to prevent another country from becoming ultimately the largest economy in the world. And it's China's turn to have the foot placed on its neck. I'd like to get your reaction to that, and I'd like to get Anabel's reaction to that too, as we
Let me just tell you one thing. I will be very heterodox on that. I don't think Trump is, to be more precise, Trump is the first president of the United States. Obama did it intellectually when he created the concept of pivoting to the Pacific. It was an anticipation. Remember that Hillary Clinton, instead the fact that she was closer to the negotiations, was also to the withdrawal of the United States from the Trans-Pacific Agreement, not only Trump. Protectionism.
But do you think that was not a political statement?
No, it is a political statement. I have no doubts, and I will answer your question. And protectionism has a long history in the United States. It didn't start in November 8, 2016. We all live with Buy American Act and Buy America Act. Okay? And America is a pendulum from isolationism to expansionism or multilateralism. Okay, this said, I would say Trump is the first president that put the finger in a discomfortable way, in an aggressive way. I don't love the style, and sometimes I disagree with the concept itself, because he is apparently, in my perception, Trump has a 70s mind, a pre-globalization mind, okay? And you have more and more people, pre-globalization leading countries. Wait a little bit in England if Corbyn will become prime minister, and you will see what is a Fabian leader pre-globalization, okay? They don't understand the chain, the integration of the chain of value. Okay, but being back, Trump is putting the finger to the real first American problem. Who is the challenger? It's not Russia, it's China. China in 40 years became world goods leader exporter, from 0.8 of global trade to 12% of global goods trade in 40 years. China is the first client of 70 countries. But China is not only largely, by far, the largest beneficiary of the globalization. China became the challenger on digitalization. If you see the top 10 of the techno world companies, you will see 7 Americans or 6 Americans, and you will see 3 Chinese or 4 Chinese. You will see none from Europe. The first European techno company is Spotify. Okay, so this should be the red light in Brussels. Not where to tax Apple, but why the European capitalism is not able to build one of the techno giants of economy, of the 4.0 economy. So the challenger for United States is China, is challenging them on goods, on services less, and in the digital competition. And so, yes, the question is not a question of tariffs, it's not a question of conditionalities, it's a political question. Who will be the world #1 superpower? The written commitment from the last Congress of Communist Party of China is #1 superpower. It's not the second superpower, okay? But this is, and we are living, we have to give, don't forget the context. We have a new economic order where Asia and China are the rising stars. But we don't have a new political order coherent with that change. Our political order is the heritage of Second World War, okay? So I think, yes, it's a political question, and it's not a provisional one. I don't think a Democrat president would, the approach would be different, the style would be different, but I don't think the question of China would be different for a Democrat president.
I want to give Anabel an opportunity to jump in here.
I'm going to be very brief because I know Uri also wants to say something on this,
exactly.
but I just want to read a quote from Bill Clinton in 1983, who said, "I am particularly concerned by Japan's growing global current and account and trade surpluses, and deeply concerned about the inadequate market access for American firms, products, and investment in Japan." So this is to say that I do think that there are important differences, from where we are today than where we were in the 80s and early 90s, and I think it's different. But I have to say that there are also some parallelisms, in the sense that at that time, Japan was being accused of currency manipulation by the U.S. and the EC at the time. Japan, South Korea were being accused for industrial targeting. And if you go and look at the declaration that launched the Uruguay round at the time, basically, it has a lot of this language that we are listening to today. There was a talk about high technology. There was a question about imbalances in the economy. There was a question of protectionism. A third of the world trade was subject to quantitative restrictions, and others at the time. So, and at that time, leaders sort of rose up to the occasion, and after many challenging sort of discussions, launched the Uruguay round. Took a long time to conclude, but it was signed here in 1994, as Ricardo was saying, the agreement that established the WTO. And I remember I was here. It was my first time here in Marrakesh in 1994. I remember the nice sweets that they offered to us here as well. But I also remember this sense that, this was the creation of a new sort of era of global governance. And I think that ultimately the Uruguay round solved many of the issues at the time. So the point that I want to make is that it is through multilateral conversations, however difficult they may be, that some of these issues will get resolved.
I want to get to WTO, but I also want to get Yuri into this and sort of respond to whether we're talking here, seeing a case of deja vu. And then I want to go to the audience to get you involved in this conversation as well.
Just very quickly, I don't think we should leave the audience with the impression that we are now facing, 100 years conflict between China and the United States, and it's inevitable because, of course, that would be disastrous for the global economy, for world trade, for every public good you can imagine, from climate change to fisheries, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's the wrong impression to give. I believe that there is, at the moment, a current in the United States which is very strong, which is anti-China, and which is saying they've gone too far, okay? They've taken advantage of the system. There are too many distortions in the system, and we have to correct these distortions. That's very different than saying we have decided that for geopolitical reasons, we're going to suppress China, which of course many people understand, including I suspect everybody in this room, is not possible anyway. You're not going to keep China down. And there are a lot of people in the United States who see this and who understand that it's a much more complicated situation and that will be looking for compromise. Trump himself, I am not at all convinced, is out to sort of, go for China's throat and, kill China. Not at all. I think he's a deeply misled individual, but he's essentially transactional, okay? And I genuinely believe that when he got together with Xi Jinping presented him with 75 reform measures that they intend to do and are currently under negotiation, that Trump will be willing to make a compromise and backtrack on the tariffs, especially as he goes into the elections. So the United States is very complex. There are very different currents, and there is a very, very important current that says, no, let's be sensible about this. We're not going to go to war with China.
There's so much more to discuss about China, but let's try to get some questions. Questions, a microphone? Thank you. Let's start here. Can you please say who you are?
Well, I enjoyed very much the beginning of your session, and I was particularly struck by this tendency, this tendency to see, the conversation, let's put it that way, between between China and the United States is the main trend coming up. But, I would like to ask to the panel, what are the security implications of all that in the long term? Because you cannot speak about trends, about protectionism, about, hostile trading without thinking about security. So it has to come out somehow in the discussion.
Okay. And we'll come back to that if I can get João involved. Question?
Thank you, John. Thank you for the debate. I think it's extremely important that we have this discussion. My favorite definition of trade is the place where economy meets politics. And that's by definition an explosive place. And I think the conversation has shown that. I could say a lot of things about Mr. Trump as an acting ambassador. I refrain from that because I want to keep my job for a few more years. But my point is more, let's say, more noble than that and more political than that. I think what we're witnessing today is a great risk of losing something that we built in the last 30 or 40 years, which is a rules-based, predictable, manageable system that has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. The alternative to that is what? I don't know what it is, but I don't think it's better than what we have today. So the issue, twofold. One, we need to win back the public opinions for globalization, for trade, for open societies and open economies. And secondly, we need to preserve, by reforming, the rules-based system. WTO was mentioned. One of the most perversive consequences of some of the United States policies these days is emptying out WTO. The appellate body is about to be non-functional because the Americans are not appointing judges over there. It looks very simple, very parochial, but it can stop the system that we built. And I don't see a better alternative, particularly, if I may say, for Europeans and Americans.
Great. Let's get a good opportunity to talk about, and I'll come back to questions in a second, but to talk about the WTO. João talked about the appellate body. There was some news on that this week where the U.S. is saying that they're not in favor of the plans that Europe. Are you optimistic? Are we seeing the end of the WTO? What do you think?
I think the ambassador is right in point. The WTO, the set of rules that we've had for the past 17 years, has been instrumental in terms of delivering great prosperity across the world. And many countries, many people have benefited from this. If you look, for instance, at 1970, for example, and the number of extreme poor today, that number has been lowered by 3. And that, I mean, while the job is not finished, this is pretty amazing. And trade has played a very significant role, trade underpinned by this global set of rules. Now, this global set of rules and the institutional as such is under threat. It is under threat. You mentioned the fact that the appellate body in the WTO may become non-functional as of next year. We also have all these tariff increases that have been adopted in the name of national security, which is considered by many that do not have any justification. Likewise, the tariff hikes that others have adopted in response to this. So I think that the time has come to think seriously about the WTO reform. And I think that a number of countries, including the EU, Japan, a number of countries are coming up with proposals to look at the different parts, different functions of the WTO that have been having problems. Because it is true that the problems have not just arisen today. We have been having problems with the negotiating function of the WTO. There have been some successes, for instance, the trade facilitation agreement, but the reality is that it has become very difficult to reach agreement on a number of issues. So this is something that we need to look at. Can the WTO bring in more flexible alternatives to allow for agreements among sets of countries, clubs within the WTO, if you wish? We need to look at how to strengthen the dispute settlement process. We need to look at about how to strengthen the monitoring function of the WTO. But it is by reforming the WTO that we will be able to set the conditions for prosperity going forward and not by destroying the organization.
A question? Oh, okay. Ricardo, let's
just the two
quickly.
2 seconds. Just a compliment to what Anabel was saying, because I think it's important. So what is the U.S. attack to the appellate body and the complaint with respect to its functioning? And it's very important to understand that there are some issues that may have to do with procedures and so on, but there's some other that are very fundamental differences between the U.S. and the rest of the membership, including the EU. And they have to do with at least two aspects. One is historical. It has to do with the specific disagreement of on the part of the U.S. with a result in the Uruguay round on the methodology that is used in the calculation of anti-dumping. So it's a long story, but basically that has led to 22 or so resolutions from the appellate body that have been interpreted by the U.S. as overreach of the appellate body, meaning that they are interpreting an agreement for which they have a different understanding. But there's another allegation that I think is more important to understand, and that's this school of thought which goes beyond trade and which has to do with ensuring that the U.S. is not ceding sovereignty, and therefore trade, the management of disputes in trade agreements should be through a political mechanism and not a quasi-judicial court as we have in the WTO. And that's a more fundamental one. And it's been also a feature of the Trump administration approach to the renegotiation of NAFTA and to other agreements. And so I think this is where you ask, are we optimistic about the resolution of this question? And it's I'd say it's unknown at this stage what would actually be the end game if those very fundamental questions remain unresolved.
Paulo,
just to underline one thing, I'm more pessimistic, but I basically, because in the war, in the tension between the United States and China, you have a more sensitive element, which is the digital and the cyber question. This is defining power is defining power more and more to the future. The current president of the United States vetoed more acquisitions and fusions from Chinese companies in technological American companies, even e-payment companies, than all the precedent presidents. And the same thing, by the way, the criticism towards China is not just an American one. Europe doesn't tweet, but Europe has the same kind of critics in its relation of China. Don't forget, China invested 7 times more in Europe than Europe in China. That means some markets in China have no free access. We all know that. The other thing is questions on transfer of technology or intellectual property are both questions from both sides of the Atlantic towards China. And I agree, the best scenario we can consider is a reform of WTO, obviously. And I personally think that the United States of America will never leave WTO, because they can you can have tweets, critics, blah, 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 blah. But at the end of the day, it's the own international institution. By the way, in an American mindset world, where we can solve conflicts, namely with China, and namely from the United States with China. Just see the figures in WTO.
Let's get the audience involved. Please identify yourself.
I'm Alfredo Valadao from Sciences Po in Paris. I wonder if we are not underestimating the huge change in the relationship between trade and economic prosperity. Mm-hmm. Because we are today in a transition period from a model of the 20th century, which was mass production for mass consumption, to a new form of economy, which is networked production using all the digital new technologies for customized and personalized consumption. This model, at least in the big markets like the United States and Europe, needs less commodity, less primary products, and less global value chains. In fact, global value chains today have a problem because they are more and more losing margins to this new kind of economy and producing, in fact, good enough products for good enough consumers. And this is an end game, little by little. Which means that's why we have a lot of mergers and acquisitions now in global value chains. And this leads for less trade on parts, because we know that 80% of trade is parts and components. So it is much less on all this. So we have to think much when we talk about WTO and all this, how all these institutions will have to adapt to this new world. And the worst case scenario is that in the end, maybe Europe and the United States will need much less the rest of the world to have a prosperous economy. And so we have to take that in our thinking.
Excellent. Let's get some more comments from the audience.
Yeah, Marcos Freitas from Brazil. I was just wondering, Paulo, and that's my question. One of the things that the Chinese did throughout time is that by becoming the factory, the global factory of the world, they also became the outsourced for pollution, right? They took over the pollution of the world to become the industry of the world. Now, do you see a movement in the countries? As we know, we realize that everyone has deindustrialized as a result of China becoming the global factory. Do you see a movement of people accepting the idea that pollution might come back to their countries once they go back to reindustrializing or producing some of the things that the Chinese still do? Is there a move? Are you concerned that it will have an environmental impact to make things back in your home countries?
Let's take 2 more questions, and then we'll give the audience, the panel, an opportunity to address many of these questions. Please.
Thank you. I'm Clement Tonche from the Institute of International Economic Relations in Athens, Greece. A very brief question to Mr. Paulo Portas on the EU, which seems to be between a rock and a hard place. caught up in the crossfire between the US and China, its biggest trade partners. I know it's a toughie, and I know it's a hypothetical question, but if the EU were to choose between, between the US and China, just speaking hypothetically, do you think it would be closer to the US? And you're right that the Europeans basically hate Trump's manners, but they are not entirely unhappy with his harsh stance vis-à-vis China. And a quick question to Mr. Ortiz. On the WTO, there's a theory that the Chinese have built a very competent core of legal experts, and they've learned how to manage the ropes and all the loopholes, within the WTO. So if that is true, it looks like they're becoming a conservative force within the WTO. And in fact, this is why they're against the reform of the organization. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll take one more question, and then we'll give the panelists an opportunity to answer some of the questions. Please.
Thanks very much. My name is Saeed El Hashimi. I happen to work for the World Trade Organization, so I have to be careful what I say.
Can you stand up?
Yes, please. So everybody sees me.
Yes,
so
exactly.
No, just leaving Geneva yesterday, a friend of mine talking about China and the US said, this is two elephants dancing in a porcelain shop. And the porcelain shop being the WTO. So we have to be really careful. But we have to give a merit to the tension that we have. It would have been really not imaginable to see talking about reform in the WTO just last year. So that's a merit in its case. Now my question to Anabel and Ricardo, because they come from the South as I do, there's this political issue of development or being a developing country in the WTO, which is self-declaratory, and which is one of the points the US is asking for reform. Where do you see this going in terms of reform? Because it's not just China, it's also India, Brazil, and the others.
Terrific, thank you. We'll start with Anabel, and we'll go down the line, and if you can answer one of the questions that was posed, please.
Listen, a lot of material, great questions. I don't know which one to take. I like all of them, but I'm going to take this last one by Saeed to say that I don't think that at the end of the day, what matters are labels. I don't think it's really important whether you call yourself a developed country, a developing country, or what. I think the question is, what is the contribution of different countries to the system? And from that perspective, it is true that a number of emerging economies could contribute more to the system. And I think that you see that negotiation, you can see that, negotiation by negotiation. So there is an opportunity, for instance, for the Chinese to show that they can actually come in and contribute more to the system, because the system has been very beneficial to them. I think the point that was made before about China having a stake in the organization, I think it is true. But that is also true for other emerging economies as well. So in going forward, when thinking about a reformed WTO in the future, I think that this is one important element to take into consideration.
Yuri?
Yeah, so on China, US, EU, my reading is that the EU has its criticisms of China, of course, like does the United States and Japan, by the way, that we haven't mentioned. But the EU and Japan are a lot closer to China in the current situation in terms of the workings of the WTO and the sustaining of the multilateral trading system. They are absolutely committed to the multilateral trading system, and that begins with China and the European Union. So it's a complicated tango that's going on. At the same time, people are, the EU is perfectly ready to use the United States-China dispute as a leverage to get China to change. But again, my reading is that none of this is fundamental, certainly not from the point of view of the EU. This is not about divorce proceedings. This is about, who washes the nappies and who does the dishes, okay, in order to make it clear to you. And certainly that's true from the point of view of the European Union, Japan, Canada, et cetera, I believe from the United States as well, although we disagree on that in the final analysis. On the issue of global value chains, I actually don't buy the argument that we are, there is some shift in terms of capacity to manufacture domestically, more competitively using automation, et cetera, But I just quote to you the latest UNCTAD numbers. The latest UNCTAD numbers show that only 1/4 of world trade consists of consumer products today, which means that 3/4 of international trade today is raw materials, parts, and machinery, okay? So maybe one day we will not need all these global value chains, but I tell you, the world economy as it is at the moment is based on global value chains, and that is a very important reason to be optimistic about the resolution of these disputes. Because what hasn't been said in this whole discussion is that when Trump puts on his tariffs, especially if he goes the full hedge, the full spectrum on China, what he's doing is he's putting tariffs on enormous amounts of stuff that American industry needs in order to be able to produce. And that's why politically, ultimately, this line is not viable, and that will become very clear in the next election.
Paulo, a question of who washes the nappies?
I will pick the one that our friend, the Italian ambassador, magnificent ambassador, NATO College and NATO Foundation. It was a very smart question. And after geoeconomics and after geoeconomics rise of China, what will happen on security? It's you had a very interesting evidence in 2017. President Trump decided to raise the military spending of the United States. Who was the only country in the world of the big powers able to follow the American decision? China. Don't be very worried. The current military budgets in the world are 600 billion United States, 171 China, rising, and the third is Saudi Arabia or Russia, on 2 digits. So the American leadership on military budget is by far very strong, even if China is doing now the way to becoming also a military power, namely on Navy, namely on the maritime power, because of the corridor of the sea of southern China, and that means energetic independence, because China imports 65% of energy that needs daily to function. So just the last quote is on, there is one very good side. I'm pro-globalization. It's unbelievable. Just in a world of perceptions and not in a world of facts is acceptable the European or the American criticism about globalization. The planet is much more fair than 50 years ago. And I never saw poors from Asia, poors from Africa, or poors from Latin America demonstrating against globalization. Okay? So the world is not, we cannot see the world with European or American glasses as if it was enough. Okay? There are a lot of beneficiaries of globalization, hundreds of millions are out of extreme poverty, and this should make us think about the Eurocentric and the American-centric criticism. My remark is, there's a very good side, another very good side on globalization. There are no empty spaces. You have a much more economic pluralistic world than before. And the good example was exactly the Trans-Pacific Agreement. The United States decided, we withdraw. It was a zero-cost decision because it was not for the moment, it was before the beginning of the treaty, okay? So they withdraw. What happened after? 1 year after, in Santiago de Chile, March 8 of 2018, 14% of global GDP countries, led by Japan, Mexico, Canada, Australia, South Korea, Singapore, signed the Trans-Pacific Agreement without United States. Why did Japan lead the pressure to reconstruct and to rebuild the Trans-Pacific? Not against the United States, to contain China, because China was organizing the regional commerce soft free trade agreement with Pacific countries. So it was, United States withdraw, Japan fixed the opportunity and threatened, led the initiative, convinced Canada and Mexico and Australia, and you have the Trans-Pacific representing not 38% of the world GDP, but 14% of the world GDP. So, like in Africa, free trade agreement in Africa for Africans, like in the Pacific countries, this world is a complex one, is an unpredictable one, yes, because we don't have the new political order, but you have much more opportunities and there are no empty spaces. Don't take it for granted, because you can lose it, okay?
Ricardo, do you want to get in this round?
Yes. So let me do something different, which is choose 3 questions, but I'll be bullet points on them. I promise. So first, Alfredo's question on the question of technology, and so it is true that the WTO, as splendid as agreement as it is, and it's behind the technological change that we have been through and that we are going into in the global economy, and which is going to change all these relations. So, a T-shirt which is $3.50 to $5.50 in Bangladesh in terms of production, now it's about 16 cents in a fully automated facility in the U.S. And so that means that we're going to face really very serious changes in that global economy, and we don't have yet the framework. Caveat, what Paulo just said is very important in that respect. The CTPPP, the EU CETA with Canada, and other new generation agreements are sort of a race to the top in that respect, as well as with on the question of the environmental the linkages that the WTO still is behind. So we may be seen, as I was saying before, in the medium term, as something like the emergence from the margins of a new order that is much better than what we have today. And once we go through the interregnum that we are living through. The second question is China a conservative force for change in the WTO? I don't think that's probably the right way to put it. I think that it's obvious, and it's absolutely true, that China has developed incredible capacity to participate in dispute resolution. It's very impressive what they've done in the past 15 years or 16 years or so. But they would probably participate in WTO reform, I believe, and I've been in discussions where this is being considered. Only that fundamental question that I was referring to before of whether to have a binding dispute settlement mechanism that acts as a quasi-judicial with an appeal court is probably going to be the one thing that China will not be ready to compromise. On the other issues, the issues related to subsidies, for instance, with respect to state-owned enterprises, or on questions of technology, upgrading the rules on technology, and so on, China may be able to sit down and start negotiating on those. Indeed, I know that in Beijing, there is consideration of proposing a negotiation of China and the CPTPP. But they would only do it if other issues are brought to the table. So they have their own list of issues that they would like to also see addressed in the WTO reform process. And then just quickly to say its question, on the development issue, it is a major question. For the U.S., it's clear that well, they don't want to see China where applicable, because China, when China entered the WTO, in the protocol of accession, it took sort of a middle ground between a developing and a developed country, with a very nuanced approach to that. But obviously it doesn't want to see China seizing itself of the opportunities, particularly of with respect to flexibilities or exceptions in the current WTO rules. However, going forward, I think we have now learned from the last negotiation in the WTO, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, that there are other means of addressing the question of the asymmetry in capabilities with respect to the implementation of the WTO agreements. So if you combine capacity building, if you combine aid for trade and other tools with the implementation of rules, then you may have something like on-ramps that allow countries to participate in the agreements. And that may be a way that, again, I think even China may be ready to accept that. So I think in the new generation of agreements, starting with the only one that may be possible by the end of 2019, which is the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement, you may see now new ways of addressing the development issue that may get us out of that discussion. No, the question.
I think Ricardo, we're almost out of time.
Sure.
I wonder if we can take a couple of questions from the audience, if we can be very brief.
Si vous permettez, je vais parler en français. Salah Alalou, je suis senior fellow de Policy Center for New South Morocco. On comprend bien sûr que la Chine dérange par ses excédents vis-à-vis des États-Unis et même un peu l'Europe, et par son avancée du numérique, c'est clair. Et je comprends bien sûr que surtout les États-Unis se défendent. Tout à fait normal. Parce qu'un déficit, il faut toujours le gérer. Mais j'ai deux questions. La première, c'est que est-ce que vous ne croyez pas qu'il y a tellement d'interdépendance entre les États-Unis et la Chine qu'en fin de compte, ils vont négocier, ils vont trouver des solutions. D'autant plus que la Chine est en train de trouver des substituts à ses exportations. Avant tout, son marché intérieur, domestique, qui est en train de s'élargir. Et ça ne peut être qu'en faveur et de l'Europe et des États-Unis. Et en deuxième lieu, elle est en train d'élargir sa présence dans sa proximité asiatique, de l'Inde au Pakistan à tous les pays qui l'entourent. Ça, c'est ma première question. La seconde, malgré tout, durant ces 40 dernières années, la montée de la Chine, c'est une bonne chose avant tout pour la Chine, mais ça a été aussi une bonne chose pour tout l'Occident. C'est une bonne chose pour l'économie américaine. C'est une bonne chose pour l'économie européenne, qui ont tiré une bonne partie de leur croissance des achats provenant de la Chine. Alors, c'est à partir de là. Et après la crise 2008, là aussi, c'est la demande quand même provenant de la Chine qui a aidé beaucoup de pays du Nord à dépasser cette crise. Bon, ma question, est-ce qu'il ne faut pas aller vers une question plus profonde? Est-ce que les systèmes économiques, productifs, aux États-Unis, en Europe, et même les systèmes politiques, c'est-à-dire la démocratie, n'ont pas besoin de s'adapter, de chercher, d'imaginer des nouveautés pour pouvoir s'adapter à la montée de la Chine. Donc il y a un effort interne à faire. Merci.
Merci. Okay. Here. You first, and then we'll get you.
William Zartman, a comment to an earlier comment. There is one major reaction to globalization, and that's Al-Qaeda. That's where it comes from. But an earlier comment on the United States and Chinese competition, it's not just for number one, but it's that that competition take place on an even playing field, and that China be brought into the norms of international economic competition, particularly in regard to the theft of intellectual property and also to the state support for industry.
Okay. And if we can hand it to your colleague.
Thank you. Quick question. Emil Chirena from the Dominican Republic, Global Foundation for Democracy and Development. As much as it is clear to everyone in this room that free trade is actually a good thing and that it has lifted millions out of poverty, it is not so clear for some political audiences at the domestic level. And that is something that we're seeing in Europe, in the US, everywhere. So my quick question is, how do we change the political dialogue and actually make those that are arguing against free trade in domestic politics realize that it is in their interest to actually continue having a rule-based order? How do we win hearts and minds? Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, my name is Dr. Diop. I'm a minister in the cabinet of the president in Senegal. I'm very pleased to be follow this discussion. To me, there's just an important continent missing in your discussion, Africa. We are here in Africa, and it looks like you see the future between United States, Europe, and China. And I think you need to think about who's now having the resources for the future. The petrol, the raw materials, agriculture, and also this fantastic demographic trend for the next consumers. China understood that. I fully agree with my friend from France, because China is expanding its market to Africa also. So I believe that if you really, in this discussion, you need to look at the future. In the next 10 years, 20 years, you know that the petrol, the gas, the gold, many things are in Africa. What was missing are two things: the governance, the technology also, and also the capital, all this investment, the foreign investment. And you know that today this is... So I would like to ask, how do you see the future, the WTO? What is for you the role of Africa? Because for us, we don't see it like that. Now you need to consider that there's another player for the future in this globalization, and I fully agree that we don't see any problem to globalization. We just need to be ready. And we are getting ready. Morocco is getting ready. Senegal is getting ready. So Nigeria. So I believe in your discussion, I would like to know, how do you see this, the future? What is the role of Africa in this? Thank you very much.
And our final question from the audience.
Thank you. Dominique Boquet from Sciences Po Paris. I think the problem with China is not the past. It's the future, and the future power of China, which is a big concern. It's a concern for Europe as well as for the US. But the European answers are not at all the same as the Trump administration is bringing, since the answer would be WTO rules deepening, which is not in the agenda of the American administration.
Exactly.
So I think for Africa, as for Europe, or for many third countries, there is concern for the rules and concern also for a deal between China and the US, which would be a deal with many infringements to the equality of rules. And I think this is the question that can convey us to another clue, not WTO deepening if it's impossible, but more FTA agreements and the deepening of FTA agreements, which was the case in the EU-Japan agreement, which is a very interesting one, including on standards. And I think one of the questions that can be raised from that is, what can Africa do? Of course, there is a need for lower tariffs within Africa, but also an answer to the standards question, I think, which is very important for the future of Africa.
Thank you very much. We've got maybe a little less than 5 minutes left. If we can just go down and take about 30, 45 seconds to answer each question.
Well,
I know I'm asking a lot.
Great comments. I see 4 scenarios. Full-fledged trade war. Who wins? No one. Certainly not Africa, not Latin America, not Europe, not China, and not the United States. Second scenario, managed trade. Who wins? Not Africa, not Latin America, not Europe, and I'm not sure either whether anybody else really wins in this scenario. Third scenario, the uncertainty continues, which again, not good for anyone. The fourth scenario, which is the only one which I think should be plausible, is really a combination of WTO reform with greater flexibility built in it to allow for groups of countries to come together and negotiate different areas. Plus, I agree that there's an important room for the preferential trade agreements to play. But preferential trade agreements, while I am a great fan of them, I have negotiated 12 of these agreements for my country. Reality is they cannot substitute for the WTO reform. One point, agricultural subsidies, a theme of great importance for many African countries, for example. That will not get solved in any bilateral agreement. It needs to be solved in the context of the WTO. So to me, the scenario that all of us should be rooting for is WTO reform plus these preferential agreements.
Thank you, Anabel. Yuri?
Yeah, so first of all, I agree with Mr. Walalulu's comment about China. China's rise has accelerated world economic growth by a significant margin. I haven't done the calculations, but I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't add 1% to world economic growth over the last 20, 30 years. That would not have been there otherwise, and of course that benefits everybody. Second, China has changed. Now it's running a current account is imbalanced now. China is importing as much as it's exporting. This has to be understood. It's a very different country than it was 10 years ago. The point about Africa, the main point I'll make on Africa is Africa has three vital interests to resolve these issues. Number one, it needs the WTO rules because these are small countries and it needs that legal system to be supported. Number two, it needs China to continue to grow because China is the biggest market for natural resources of Africa. And the third is China is the biggest investor in Africa, particularly in infrastructure and particularly in transport infrastructure, which Africa needs desperately. In order to trade. And finally, on the question of how do you win the hearts and minds? Through the pockets. And what I mean by that is the issue with the Gilets jaunes and the people in the Midwest who are dying of the opioid epidemic and many of whom are voting for Mr. Trump. The issue is the same. Stagnation of incomes and lack of good jobs compared to the situation 20, 30 years ago. It isn't just due to China. By far the biggest effect has to do with technology, not with China. Nevertheless, this technological revolution combined with trade, globalization, etc., has led to an extreme opening of the income distribution, widening of the income distribution. You have to help these people more, okay? All of the other discussions and arguments, they will listen politely. But in the end, it's what Macron did in his émission earlier this week, 100 euros.
Paulo?
Il est allé aux enchères, non? Bon, je fais mon hommage à la France que j'adore, mais écoutez, le problème de la France, si on suggère que la responsabilité, la culpabilité, c'est la globalisation, mon Dieu, la France a 100% de dette publique, 56% de dépenses publiques sur le PIB et 49% de pression fiscale sur le PIB. Ça ne fonctionne pas et c'est un problème français. OK, bon. Donc, écoutez, si vous ajoutez les cotisations sociales, c'est 48,4. OK, et la comparabilité est OK, non, c'est pas un problème d'exagérer. C'est pas un problème d'exagérer. J'ai contribué à créer au Portugal un système d'attraction de Français prospères comme vous savez, et ils ont très bien répondu. Ça veut dire que la France, parfois, fait une pression fiscale exagérée. Ça serait évidemment ma conclusion, mais je laisse. Écoutez, 100%, 56% surtout de dépenses publiques. Comment vous voulez qu'une économie fonctionne? Avec ça, avec ce poids de l'État, avec cette force d'appropriation de la richesse créée par les gens. Donc, il n'y a aucun cas en Europe similaire, 56% de dépenses publiques sur le PIB. Okay? Bon, mais finalement, ce que je voudrais, c'est une remarque à propos de ce qu'on vient de dire, c'est que la globalisation, c'est aussi une conséquence de la globalisation. La liberté, c'est en valeur universelle. La démocratie, ce n'est pas un système universel. Et ça, c'est une méditation. Je vois de plus en plus de pays en Afrique, en Asie, même en Amérique latine et en Europe de l'Est, tenter, avec une certaine inclination plus grande, plus petite, pour ce modèle. Je l'appelle modèle Singapour pour être neutral. Ça veut dire, pour ne pas ajouter de la controversie. Mais modèle Singapour, ça veut dire autorité politique forte et non discutée, libéralisation économique agressive, croissance soutenue et forte, et inclusion sociale à travers la croissance. Ce modèle est une énorme tentation pour beaucoup de nations, classes moyennes, jeunes générations et décideurs. Donc, comprenons que la liberté des êtres humains, ça c'est global, évidemment. Mais la démocratie, ce n'est pas un système universel. Hein. C'est tout simplement le moins mauvais système, dans la définition churchillienne, le moins mauvais système qu'on a rencontré pour respecter les idées des autres, disons comme ça. Mais moi, je vois le modèle, n'oubliez jamais, le modèle de Deng Xiaoping, c'était le fondateur de Singapour. C'était pas Westminster.
Okay. Ricardo?
So very briefly, I think that maybe following on Paulo's, my comment really has to do with how there's no better possibility going forward, as Anabel said, as a WTO reform. However, the challenge is, how do you build a tent, so a framework, a system, that is capable of governing over one global economy and many economic systems, and particularly three leading: the US with a hyper-capitalism, entrepreneurial, individualistic system, the EU with a social market economy system, and China with a collectivist economy with intervention from the state, plus the many others that are in between. So the thing here it is to make sure that the frameworks that are built going forward allow for the coexistence, but take care of the negative spillovers of the policies and obviously level the playing field. It's not about fitting everyone under one economic system. And I think that goes also to the question that was asked on how do we address how people feel about globalization and these institutions that govern over the global economy.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your questions, and please join me in thanking your panel.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you. An announcement. Oh.
Oh, wait.
Okay. Okay. Because so you're missing a bag that has a notebook that plus a personal notebook. Okay. Thank you all again very much. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our afternoon sessions. Starting 7:30, we invite you to please join us for a traditional Moroccan dinner at the Mamounias Le Marocain. Dinner will start at 7:30 at the Mamounias Le Marocain. Please follow signs and staff directions and enjoy your meals.